The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
There are so many experiences that are basic to being human that we won't talk about publicly because we don't want to express them. And then everyone else who is experiencing them feels terribly alone, and they feel like a foreigner or an alien. So one of the things good stories do is they say, okay, this is what it's like to experience a broken heart, for example, right? Or embarrassment or shame. And by hearing those stories, we're better able to interpret our own lives and make sense of our experiences.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Alan Noble is Associate Professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University and Editor-in-Chief of Christ and Pop Culture. His new book is You Are Not Your Own, Belonging to God in an Inhuman World. Tim Keller has said, Alan is, I hope, the beginning of a new generation of scholar writers who can bring the insights of some of the more esoteric critics of the modern self down to earth and apply them in the most practical, compelling, and helpful form. May Alan's tribe increase. Yes and amen. May Alan Noble's tribe increase. Alan Noble, I'm so glad that you have made time to be on the Habit Podcast today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So your new book is You Are Not Your Own. And in many ways, this is an anthropology book.
It is.
Tell me what, of course, this is not a, tell me why we might call this an anthropology book. Let's start there.
Yeah, that's a good question. So as I'm thinking through some of the social ills that plague our society, it seemed to me, I was actually just thinking about the Heidelberg first question and answer. What is your only comfort in life and death? That you are not your own, but belong body and soul in life and death to your Savior, Jesus Christ. And when I thought about it in context of that, and this idea of belonging and the question of, well, what does it mean? What are we fundamentally as human beings? What is our relationship to others? Do we belong to ourselves or do we belong to someone else? Mm-hmm. And as I thought through a lot of as I said, the social ills that I see plaguing society. So, for example, the tremendous problem that questions of identity pose, the modern, very slippery idea of identity. When I think about specific ills like, heavy pornography use, the use of drugs to dull ourselves, and all these other sorts of things. It seemed to me that a lot of them assumed a certain kind of anthropology. Specifically, it assumed that we are our own and we belong to ourselves. And then from that basis, everything else is built up. So that's the theory that I'm working with. I'm sort of raising the question: what if society is built based on an anthropology that's false? What would happen? What would happen? And I think that the natural result would be that we'd be miserable, that we'd be living in a foreign environment, and that certainly feels like it's the case with us.
And by anthropology, you just mean our idea of what a human being is.
That's right.
You start with the image of the way that lions in captivity, even in the best possible, settings, the best zoos are still a little crazy.
That's right.
They pace and they and the best we can do for them still isn't very good. And you used a term I've never heard before, zoochosis. Psychosis of a zoo animal. But of course, we also live in a human-built environment built by people who aren't terribly good at.
That's right.
Yeah, like we're stuck living in human cultures, and human cultures succeed to various degrees in creating cultures that we can be sane in.
That's right.
And you make the case, as you've already said, that a culture that assumes that we belong to ourselves may be a hard place to live as a sane person.
Yeah, and specifically what happens is it creates what I call these responsibilities of self-belonging. So if we assume that we are our own, then all of a sudden our lives become these projects, and we're the only one working on the project. We're the only one who can define the project. We're the only one who can decide when the project is complete. And that kind of endlessness is destructive to our souls. For example, what ends up happening is that in order to feel like our identity is secure, we have to constantly be projecting it out into the world. Is something called expressive individualism, right? And so you're on social media constantly saying, this is my brand, this is who I am, this is who I am. So you have some kind of affirmation that you have a static identity, but it's never enough. You're always looking for more and more affirmation. Yeah, so that's the theory, is that based on that false anthropology, we run into all kinds of problems because the burdens it creates upon us are inhuman.
Right. And I can't look outward for my sense of self. I have to keep looking inward, and I'm so interested in this dilemma that you talk about, that on the one hand, I say nobody can tell me who I am. And on the other hand, I really need for people to affirm me in who I've decided I am. Right.
Yes.
And as you say, it requires that we express ourselves a lot, which I thought was funny.
Right. Yes. Yeah, that's one of the ironies of identity, is that in the contemporary setting where our identities are constantly seen as fluid, constantly in flux. And so what we try to do is we try to solidify them by projecting ourselves out into the world and getting affirmation. Now, in order to do that, what we want to do is we want to say, it doesn't matter what other people say. It doesn't matter what anyone thinks. I'm my own person. But that's not how identity works. Identity inherently needs a witness. There has to be somebody outside of you who can observe your identity, bear witness to it, and say something about it. Well, if your witness is the rest of the world, you're constantly going to need more witnesses. And that sounds like social media culture, right? Yeah. Like you need more and more witnesses to your existence in order to feel like it's real.
Yeah. Yeah. You, at one point you say, modern culture feels like a million people in a room, each shouting their own name repeatedly and more loudly. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Desperately. Yep.
Yeah. So what you just described, Alan, a person expressing self, needing witnesses, needing an audience, or one might say readers, that seems that, as you know, this is a podcast for writers. Conversation with writers about writing. That seems to be the situation you just described seems to me to be perhaps even more acute, or could be more acute for writers than for the average person.
Anyone who for their career is public facing and their income is directly tied to the number of people and the prominence of the people who observe them or pay for their product. Those people are going to be tempted more so than the general population to tie their sense of self-worth to numbers, right? Because you can feel like, well, if enough people read my book, then I guess I'm okay. Like I guess I've done something meaningful. I guess my life has some purpose. And then, of course, you publish your next book and it's a dud, and you feel
right. Yeah.
Oh, well, that was nice.
Yeah. But even quite apart from, the career issues, because the huge majority of people who write don't expect to make, much money at it. But still, there's this idea that as I'm putting things out into the world, I'm always asking writers, what's the smallest number of people that could read what you write, what you've written, and you still feel like that's enough, which I think is, and if anybody says, oh, just if it changes one person's life, that's enough. That doesn't, I don't buy that either, right? Because it's a lot of work to write.
It is.
And if nobody's going to read it, or if 10 people are going to read it, or if nobody reads it and only God knows that you've done it, that's something to sort through.
It is. Yeah. Because if you think about, as a writer, as a Christian writer, my question is, okay, am I using my talents to love my neighbor, right? And if I'm spending hundreds of hours working on it, so this book was probably, I think, 3 years in the making, lots of time thinking, lots of research, lots of time writing and revising. So this is a lot of time. I could be helping a lot of people do a lot of different things.
Yeah.
So you're right. You do have to ask. I mean, if it's not actually going to be for the good of my neighbor in a meaningful way, then I probably should devote my time to doing something else.
You talk about this idea of defining our own moral horizons. The idea that we live in a world in which we choose our own reasons to live. And you sort of in related ways talk about, we ask and answer why we should put up with suffering, which is something that animals probably don't do.
Right.
Human beings do. We adopt visions of the good life to work toward. And you say we're all confronted with the challenge of justifying our lives at one point or another. I think all these ideas are really closely, I know they're really closely related. We're talking about, what are the stories you tell? What story does my story fit into? And I just want to talk about that a little bit, especially, again, since writers are people who are interested in stories.
Right.
Either expressing either telling my story or giving other people a story that they can live in and live into. And
so the question, I think, for most modern people, the way they experience life is as if existence is a story, and they're the protagonist.
Okay.
And I guess I would just push back on that. Of course, it is true that we have stories and those stories it's a good thing that we have those stories. Narratives are beneficial. They're beautiful when done well. But the idea that this story is our story and we're the protagonist, I think that is that very idea of belonging to ourselves. Because what happens is you have to tell a good story. You've got to tell an interesting story. You've got to tell an exciting story. You've got to prove that your life meant something, that it was worthwhile, that it was significant. And then you're on this treadmill of trying to optimize yourself, trying to achieve certain things, and it's never enough. And as you said, you're constantly having to define your own values. So what does it mean for me to live a good life? Well, I'm going to have to figure that out for myself. Well, if you're figuring it out for yourself, you're probably going to change your mind. So then maybe midlife, which is very common, right? You have a crisis because you're like, well, in my 20s, I thought this career would establish me and I would feel a sense of significance. I get married, have some kids, I have this career. Now here I am, and this doesn't seem to give me the kind of sense of fulfillment I need. So I have to look inside myself again and find something different. And then all of a sudden the quest begins over again. And I think that's different from, in the book, I talk about Dante as a difference. He has what we would call a midlife crisis. Midway through his life's journey, he finds himself lost in the woods. The difference is that he knows who Dante is. Mm-hmm. What he doesn't know is how to follow God rightly. And that's what the Divine Comedy is that he is seeking God. He's not seeking Dante. If we were to retell the Divine Comedy today, it would be Dante trying to find himself. And that distinction, that difference, I think says volumes about the modern condition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I went hiking last week, and I read your, the part of the book that I had on the plane on the way out to Yosemite. I was on this big hike, and a woman was coming down the trail, and I'm talking. This was a Half Dome hike. It's a really, really hard hike, and she was coming down with a bundle in her hands, and in the bundle, as it turns out, was a half-drowned squirrel that she had rescued. And this squirrel had, she said it was almost dead. The birds were pecking at it, and I just felt so bad for it. I'm carrying it down to the ranger station to see if they can revive it. And it seemed obvious that there was an important part of her sense of who she was, that I'm the kind of person that would rescue a squirrel who I ran across. And I couldn't decide it's the right thing to do here to say, hey, the Rangers are not going to save that squirrel. You need to throw it in the bushes. But it was this. Yeah. I really thought about your book as I saw this woman who was, I don't want to be, I don't know how to talk about this without sounding ruder than I mean to, but it was just it was a performance. Like it was certainly, I know she was a compassionate person and cared about the squirrel.
Sure.
It was also important to her that you could see from the sort of saintly look on her face that she was expecting us to congratulate her for being so, such a squirrel lover.
Right.
And this was a really hard hike. I mean, she really did. She was working really hard for this squirrel. And I did the hike the next day. And the thought that somebody could do the last 4 miles carrying a squirrel is really astonishing. And I ran into her later, and she still had the saintly look on her face, but the Rangers had told her to throw it in the bushes, that they weren't going to rescue any squirrel. I mean, because the signs everywhere said, leave the wildlife alone. Anyway, I just took up too much time with that anecdote, but because we have valuable things to talk about. But I felt like as I saw that, and I just read your book, I thought that explains so much about what's going on here. This person who needs to.
Yeah. And I think it's important. Your impulse, I think, was right, because on the one hand, you're acknowledging she really is compassionate, and that's a good thing. So, like, what we don't want to do is say these people are a bunch of phonies, like Holden Caulfield, and say, you're all a bunch of phonies. This is all performance, because the human heart is complex, and often we do mixed things. Sometimes we do things that are genuinely good, but we do it, and we also we feel compelled to post it on Instagram because we also want to be performing at the same time. But the fact that we need to be seen doing these things, I think, does speak to the kind of identity formation and expression that is so deeply embedded in our culture. And even when it's kind of pathetic. I mean, so the example you gave, there's kind of this tragedy. So one, she's suffering, right? Like she's working really hard to save the squirrel. And two, it's pointless, right? So the image in my book is the image of Sisyphus rolling this boulder up a hill and it just rolls back down. And that's sort of the opposite, right? This woman carrying this squirrel down this hill, but it's also absurd, right? Because she's going to throw it in the bush. It's not going to accomplish anything.
And do you know how many squirrels died in Yosemite in the 2 hours she was carrying that little squirrel?
Do you know?
I don't. I thought you're the one who wrote the book.
I didn't research the squirrel population. Yeah.
But I'm sure many squirrels died in the hour or two that she was carrying that squirrel.
Yeah.
But I think she would have carried it even if I hadn't been there to see it. Right. I mean, it wasn't, I don't mean it was a performance, but that she wouldn't have done anyway. But as you said, we need an audience.
Yeah.
You can be honest. Does that anecdote seem relevant to what we're talking about here, Alan?
Yes. I mean, so one of the challenges of this book is that there are about 1 million different ways of seeing this, right? There are lots of different ways that we perform in order to feel like our identities are significant, right? So that look of, what did you a halo? What did you
I said it
call
was sort of a saintly, kind of a saintly
Yes.
look.
Right. Well, we've experienced that. I mean, we've done some good thing. And then for a little while, we've got to kind of high. We kind of feel like, okay, I guess my life matters because I've done this good thing in the world. The world's filled with suffering, but I've carried this squirrel down the trail to try to rescue it and then thrown it in a bush because there's nothing to be done. But I've done this act. And there's this phrase that J.D. Salinger uses in his book, Franny and Zooey. One of his characters says, tiny, meaningless, and sad making. And that's the phrase I think that describes a lot of our human efforts at being ourselves, at trying to be our own. So that what that woman was doing was tiny and it was meaningless and it was empty. In the end, it was like, that didn't matter. It was empty. But it's that... But then tiny, meaningless, and sad making, because that last part, because it is kind of sad. You kind of feel like you're so desperate to feel alive that you'll do this thing that's absurd.
Yeah.
So I think that is relevant.
Or you might ask your podcast guest, was that really a good anecdote? Can you tell me, was that a good anecdote? Yeah, that's another way to to express this.
That's true.
Or to enact this need. Okay. Well, let's see here. I know what I wanted to ask you about. It was this idea. You said the sort of modern narrative, the story that we tell over and over again is the story of self-discovery, right? The person who, every Disney movie, the world's trying to tell them who they are, right. And they say, no, I'm not listening to you. I'm going to go do this other thing. I sing my I Want song at the beginning, and then I go get it. And
right.
And so, and freedom is defined as the absence of constraints. It's defined in those negative terms. I'm throwing off constraint, and now I'm free.
Right.
What's the other story? What's the counter narrative to that story of finding oneself?
Yeah. So, to go back to Dante, I think that would be the medieval answer. And that would have been the answer for ancient Christians as well, is that your life is not a story about self-discovery, but it's a story about conforming your life to Christ, to pursuing Christ-likeness. And so there's still that self-examination. So that doesn't go away. Examining yourself is very important. The unexamined life is not worth living. So that's important. You examine yourself. But you're examining yourself not to craft some certain identity or to find the true, authentic Alan so that I can project it and receive affirmation, but to see where in my life I am not conforming to Christ-likeness, and so that I can change that. That's not as interesting as of a story, I think, to modern ears, right? But that hasn't historically been true, right? That historically, is the normal story, the life's spiritual journey.
So is it possible that the real Alan is still somebody to be discovered? In other words, not an Alan for you to invent, but an Alan for you to, like. I'm thinking about. I wrote a story called "The Charlatan's Boy" about the first line is I don't remember one thing about the day I was born, and it's a boy who the only person who's ever told him who he is a liar, and by the end of the book, he doesn't. I don't know that he knows he's on a journey of self-discovery, but anyway, he finds out who he's been all along. So that was my first thought when I saw you saying, "Well, these modern writers, they're always telling stories of self-discovery." It wasn't a self that the boy invented, right? It was a self that he was all along. I hope I'm not telling too much about the end of my own book.
No, but anyway. No. There you go. Don't even have to read it. You spoiled it. No, I think, As I said, self-reflection is important. It's important for your soul. It's important for your life. And there are ways in which we can psychologically hide from ourselves, right? So deny who we are to ourselves. And I think, so apart from these sort of philosophical questions that we're asking, I think it is the case that people can often deny parts of themselves or try to fit in certain ways that are just phony. And I think it's valuable for them to examine that and see, okay, is this true about me? The difference that I would make with the way it's often portrayed in contemporary stories is the prominence, the significance of that self-discovery, right? So you're not creating it, but you're still discovering it. For a lot of modern stories, that's the quest, right? What does it mean to live a good life? It is to discover yourself and to live authentically. That's it. That's the main thing. So whereas I would say, it's psychologically healthy. It's a good thing, right? To be self-reflective and to examine yourself and to see, okay, what is my personality like? What am I like? That can be, valuable, virtuous things to do, examinations, but it's not the center. It doesn't make your existence valid.
It's a means toward an end, hopefully.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say? That self-discovery is a means towards some bigger end than self-discovery?
Yes. So, and it's interesting because if you read Calvin's Institutes, when he's talking about how do we know God, he says you have to know yourself. Yeah. So when you examine yourself, you actually realize your sin nature and your need for God. So, and Augustine, and the Confessions, he's coming to understand himself better. Yeah. So self-reflection is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. When the quest for self-discovery is the end, then we run into problems.
Yeah. Yeah. Chesterton said the purpose of an open mind is the same as the purpose of an open mouth, so you can close on something. And that seems relevant to what we're talking about, perhaps.
Sure.
That the purpose of self-discovery is somehow so that you can then move on, or self-examination is not necessarily a life. Never mind. I'm getting off.
No. I think you're absolutely right. Yes. So the question. So a lot of the times, what we're talking about with self-discovery is a never-ending project.
Right.
So it's your whole life. You're always striving, and so we'll talk about discovery, but the trick is we don't actually believe you're discovering it because there is no contemporary sense of what that looks like. Okay, what does it actually look like to look inside yourself and find the discrete, specific Alan Noble? Where is that in your mind or your heart? That we have no sense of that. So what does that even practically mean? Well, it usually means thinking about things that you like and dislike and desire and things, the way society has shaped your desires and affections and these sorts of things. But it's not absolute. It's not objective. So there is no possible objective discovery. So we end up just going on forever. And that's part of the problem. Whereas what I'm saying is that, you do need to come to what Eliot calls the end of your exploring.
Yeah. So, Alan, to return to what you said a minute ago, you're suggesting there is or isn't a stable self to be discovered. What are you saying there? I'm not sure I quite understood what you were getting at there.
I suppose that I'm going to answer that in maybe a paradoxical way. There is an objective self that can be seen, but it can only be seen by God.
Okay.
Right. That's who that is. And I mentioned earlier that we have this desire to have a witness to our identity, somebody who can see us. Well, for the Christian, God is that witness, and He sees us truly. He sees us more truly than we see ourselves, and all the contradictions that we have in ourselves and all the ways we hide truths from ourselves. He sees through all of that. And so that's where there is an Alan. And whatever he's doing, whatever he's at, whatever his experiences and memories and sensations have been, God knows that. And so there is something static. There is something true. Now, I think for us, for humans, is if we go looking for a specific discrete self, then we're just going to run around in circles. Yeah. I don't think there is a way for us to do that. I mean, in some sense, I think identity tests, the Enneagram, the Myers-Briggs are ways of trying to quantify these things, because we really do want to be able to point to it, say, this is what I am. I'm this thing right here. But it's never true, right? I mean, you can get at some truths, but it's not you. It's not your identity. That's not how it works. So I don't think we can pinpoint a self like that. Yeah.
I mean, you're making me think about the moment in Revelation where there's the white stone that has your real name. That's now I know what my...
Right. Yeah. That's a good example.
I always hope mine turns out to say badass on
it. We'll find out.
That's right. We'll find out one of these days. Self-expression. You've talked about self-expression. Self-expression is near and dear to writers. What's a healthy posture towards self-expression?
That's interesting. That's an interesting question. So the challenge with it is our temptation to slip into what's called expressive individualism. Charles Taylor talks about this. Many others have as well. Where we feel like our identities are only secure insofar as we are perpetually expressing them. Mm-hmm. And we've already talked about how that's an insufficient way. However, expression is basic to what it means to be human. We're constantly expressing ourselves, the way we dress. I mean, everything we do is some sort of an expression of a belief, ideal, values, whatever. So expression itself is not a bad guy. When you come to feel your identity is more solidified the more you express yourself, that's probably a sign that you're finding your identity through expression rather than something else. Yeah. But self-expression is also so important because if we don't then express ourselves, then we will feel so isolated. Right. There are so many experiences that are basic to being human that we won't talk about publicly because we don't want to express them. And then everyone else who is experiencing them feels terribly alone and they feel like a foreigner or an alien. Mm-hmm. So one of the things good stories do is they say, okay, this is what it's like to experience a broken heart, for example, right? Or embarrassment or shame. And by hearing those stories, we're better able to interpret our own lives and make sense of our experiences. So expression itself is not a bad thing. The question is, what is our self-expression doing? Uh-huh. And for some artists, self-expression is what makes them alive, that they express themselves. And that's where I would say, something is problematic right there.
Yeah. I think it, especially for writers, it might be helpful to think of self-expression as a given. Like as I write, I'm just expressing myself. I'm not here to express myself. I'm here to talk about some truth I didn't invent. Yeah. And in the process, then it's inevitable that I'll express myself. But I'm not going to think, how can I, express the essence of Jonathan Rogers by writing? But rather, how do I talk about whatever topic I'm talking about today, and whatever way I talk about that, I can hardly help but that be that's just going to be a kind of self-expression.
That's right.
Just like when I walk, my particular posture and gait that I'm not thinking about is a kind of self-expression.
That's right.
And I don't think I'm going to express myself through my walk. There are people who probably do, but I don't think in those terms. And I think that's a pretty healthy way to think about writing,
Because you want your reader to not come to a better understanding of Jonathan Rogers, but to come to a better understanding of truth.
Yeah.
Right. And so ideally, that's what we're doing. Right. But that's not always the case. Right. For some writers, they really do center themselves. The idea is to express themselves. They want their as a side note, I've even pro, nonfiction writers, I could think of some writers whose prose is it calls such attention to itself. I can tell that the author wants me to be thinking about him, like while I'm reading it. Mm-hmm. And it's true. Like I visualize the person sitting at a desk typing because it calls so much attention to
Absolutely.
But there's other kinds of writing where the author disappears, right? And what you're left with is the idea, the truth that needs to be, or that the author believes needs to be expressed.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the ideal, what we want to pursue.
Yeah. Well, very good. All right. I'm going to end by asking you the question I usually ask at the end of these conversations. That is, who are the writers who make you want to write?
Excellent question. So I would say Cormac McCarthy, right? So that's fiction. Okay. So that might feel strange, but
do you ever write fiction?
Not to speak of.
Yeah.
I would like to, but it's a craft, and I don't have that craft.
Yeah.
Let me see. That is a good question. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of my favorite authors aren't actually great. I don't think great. Right? I love Charles Taylor, for example, but his prose is.
I'm really thankful for the people who interpret Charles Taylor for me.
Yeah, yeah. So, it's not Charles Taylor. I mean, gosh, growing up, Francis Schaeffer, even though I would have a lot of quibbles with him today, was able to communicate a lot of truths in a way that was winsome and clear and enjoyable to read. And I think that's been something. Also, William Cavanaugh.
I don't know William Cavanaugh.
Yeah, so he wrote. What did he write? Religious Violence, or something like The Myth of Religious Violence, or something. I think that's the title of it. And I read that, and it was very influential because he focused a lot on words and how we define religion, how often people define religion in order to justify violence. And it's a fascinating book, and I like that sort of close reading, close use of language. That's been helpful to me.
Well, it might be fair to say even Charles Taylor makes you want to write because you want to communicate to make Charles Taylor's ideas accessible.
That's true. No, yeah, that's true. I guess I was just thinking in a very narrow way. No, a lot of, So in that sense, there are actually a lot of people. Yeah. So Zygmunt Bauman is, I think, a great author who's more dense than the average person needs to wade through. I love Jacques Ellul. He's a central part of this book, this latest book, and a French sociologist. Those are probably the main ones.
All right. Well, Alan Noble, I really appreciate this time. I've enjoyed the heck out of this, and it's nice to meet you. So I hope we can talk again one of these days soon. Maybe next time you write a book.
That'd be great.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Thanks.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate. Special thanks as well to Taylor Linhart for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for Season 3 of the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorlinhart.com.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.